They forced his mouth open. He screamed, but no sound could escape what was coming. The richest man in Rome, the man who had crushed thousands under his wealth, who thought gold could buy him everything, was about to learn gold's final lesson. The Parthian soldiers held Marcus Crassus down as molten gold, heated to 900 degrees Fahrenheit, was slowly poured into his throat. His eyes bulged, his body convulsed. The smell of burning flesh filled the desert air. This wasn't just an execution. This was a message. And it all started because one man's greed was so massive that it destroyed 40 Saracen soldiers, ended the Roman Republic, and literally burned him alive from the inside out. This is the story of how worshipping gold made him drink it. To understand why Crassus died choking on molten gold, you need to know who he was. Marcus Licinius Crassus wasn't just rich, he was obscenely rich. Imagine if Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett combined their wealth. That's Crassus in ancient Rome. His fortune was estimated at 200 million sesterces, the equivalent of over $2 trillion in today's money. But here's the twisted part. He didn't build his fortune through innovation or hard work. He built it on death. Crassus ran what historians call Rome's first fire brigade. Sounds noble, right? Wrong. When a building caught fire in Rome, Crassus would show up with his private fire brigade. But he wouldn't put out the flames. Instead, he'd watch the building burn while negotiating a price with the desperate owner. Sell me your property for almost nothing, or I'll let it burn to the ground. Once the terrified owner agreed, then Crassus would put out the fire, rebuild the property, and rent it out at massive profits. This is the kind of man we're dealing with. A man who turned human suffering into silver, human desperation into gold. But gold wasn't enough. He wanted something money couldn't buy: glory. By 55 BC, Rome was ruled by three men, the first Triumvirate: Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus. Caesar was conquering Gaul, slaughtering tribes, crossing rivers, building legends. Pompey had dominated the Mediterranean, crushing pirates, expanding Rome's power. And Crassus, he was the banker, the moneyman, the guy who paid for their glory but never got his own. At 60 years old, Crassus was tired of being called the third wheel, tired of watching younger men build statues in their honor while he counted coins in the shadows. He needed a military victory so massive, so spectacular that Rome would finally see him as a warrior, not just a wallet. So he looked east, to Parthia, a vast empire stretching from the Euphrates River to India, an empire controlling the Silk Road, the richest trade route in the ancient world, an empire drowning in gold, silver, and spices. Crassus convinced himself that if he conquered Parthia, he would have both wealth and glory. He would be greater than Caesar and Pompey combined. The Roman Senate refused to support the invasion. They knew it was illegal, reckless, dangerous. Crassus didn't care. He took 40,000 Roman soldiers, 7 full legions, and marched them into the Mesopotamian desert. His son, Publius, joined him, a young warrior eager to prove himself. They thought it would be easy. They thought the Parthians were weak, disorganized barbarians. They were wrong. The Parthians weren't barbarians. They were tactical geniuses. Their commander, Surena, was only 30 years old, but he understood something the Romans didn't. You don't fight Rome head-on. You make them chase ghosts. As Crassus marched deeper into the desert, Parthian scouts appeared on distant ridges, then vanished. Supply convoys were attacked by invisible enemies. Roman soldiers heard strange sounds at night, whispers in the wind, movements in the darkness. The scorching sun turned their armor into ovens. Water became scarce. Morale collapsed, and still, the Parthians wouldn't fight until June 9, 53 BC, near a small town called Carrhae. That's where Surena finally revealed himself, but not with infantry, not with siege weapons. With 10,000 mounted archers, the sky went black. Thousands of arrows darkened the sun as they rained down on Roman shields. Roman soldiers raised their shields, but the arrows didn't stop. Wave after wave after wave. Every time they thought the enemy had run out of arrows, fresh supplies arrived on camelback. The Romans couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, couldn't fight back. They were trapped in a storm of steel. The Parthian strategy was brilliant and terrifying. Their horse archers moved like water, flowing around the rigid Roman formations, striking from impossible distances, then disappearing before the legions could respond. Roman javelins fell uselessly into empty sand. Roman swords couldn't reach enemies who refused to come close. The heavy infantry that had conquered Europe, that had smashed through Gallic warriors and Germanic tribes, found themselves helpless against an enemy that treated warfare as an art of distance and deception. The desert became a killing ground where Roman discipline meant nothing and Roman courage counted for even less. Then Crassus made a desperate decision. He sent his son, Publius, with 6,000 cavalry to charge the Parthian lines and break their formation. Publius was brave, fearless. He led the charge with everything he had. But it was exactly what Surena wanted. The Parthian cavalry surrounded Publius's force, cut them off from the main army, and slaughtered them, every single one. The young Romans fought with desperate courage, but courage meant nothing against superior tactics and overwhelming numbers. Publius himself fought until his sword arm could no longer lift his blade, until his shield was bristling with arrows, until there was nowhere left to run and no hope left to cling to. He died in the sand, surrounded by the bodies of men who had trusted him to lead them to glory. Then the Parthians did something that broke Crassus completely. They cut off Publius's head, mounted it on a spear, and paraded it in front of the Roman army in full view of his father. Crassus watched his son's severed head bounce above the enemy lines. The great conqueror, the richest man in Rome, fell to his knees and wept. In that moment, all his wealth meant nothing. All his ambition turned to ash. The gold he had accumulated over a lifetime couldn't buy back a single breath of his son's life. The power he had wielded in Rome's marble halls couldn't reach across the blood-soaked sand to save the boy he loved. Officers tried to rally him, tried to pull him back to his duties as commander, but the man who stood up was hollow, a shell. The fire that had driven Marcus Crassus across the Euphrates had been extinguished by the sight of his son's dead eyes staring at him from atop a Parthian spear. The psychological blow was devastating not just to Crassus personally, but to the entire Roman army. Soldiers watched their invincible commander collapse in grief and realized that if their general had lost hope, what chance did they have? The carefully maintained facade of Roman superiority crumbled in an instant, replaced by the terrible understanding that they were going to die in this desert, far from home, their bodies left to bleach in the sun while carrion birds picked their bones clean. The battle was over. 20,000 Romans lay dead in the desert. Another 10,000 were captured. The survivors stumbled into the city of Carrhae, exhausted, broken, terrified. Crassus had lost half his army in a single day. The proud legions that had crossed the Euphrates singing songs of conquest now huddled behind the walls of a foreign city, jumping at shadows, flinching at every sound that might herald another Parthian attack. The wounded screamed through the night. The dying begged for water that couldn't be spared. Officers who had dreamed of triumphs in Rome now prayed simply to see Italia's shores one more time before death claimed them. The city of Carrhae offered temporary shelter, but no real safety. Everyone knew the Parthians were out there in the darkness, patient as death itself, waiting for the right moment to finish what they had started. Surena offered negotiations, a meeting between commanders to discuss terms. Crassus's officers warned him that it was a trap. They had seen enough of Parthian tactics to know that honor meant nothing to an enemy fighting for survival against Roman aggression. But Crassus was desperate, broken. He needed to believe there was a way out. Some path that didn't end with every man under his command dying in this cursed desert. So he agreed. He walked into that meeting and never walked out. What happened next depends on who you believe. Some historians say the meeting erupted into violence, a misunderstanding that turned deadly when nervous soldiers on both sides drew weapons. Others say it was planned from the beginning, that Surena never intended to let Crassus leave alive. But the result was the same. Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome, became a prisoner of the Parthians. And Surena decided to make an example out of him, not just an execution, a statement. This wasn't about one man's death. This was about sending a message that would echo across the ancient world. Rome needed to understand that its eastern frontier was not open for conquest. That Parthian sovereignty was not negotiable. That greed and ambition would be met with consequences so terrible that future Roman generals would think twice before marching their legions into Mesopotamia. Crassus represented everything the Parthians despised about Roman expansion. The arrogance, the assumption that Roman destiny justified any atrocity, the worship of wealth over wisdom. His execution needed to embody all of that, needed to become a story that mothers would tell their children as a warning about the wages of unchecked ambition. Crassus was dragged before an audience of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers. Forced to his knees, his mouth held open by soldiers. Then they brought the gold, melted in crucibles until it glowed orange-red, liquid death at 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and they poured it slowly. The molten metal hit his tongue first, instant vaporization of flesh. Then his throat, burning through tissue like acid through paper. His esophagus melted, his lungs filled with superheated metal, his internal organs cooked from the inside. Crassus thrashed, convulsed. His eyes bulged in unimaginable agony. But the Parthians held him down until the screaming stopped, until the richest man in Rome drowned in the very thing he worshipped. The execution was symbolic on multiple levels. Gold, the metal Crassus had accumulated through exploitation and cruelty, became the instrument of his destruction. The mouth that had spoken of conquest and glory was filled with burning metal. The throat that had swallowed the properties of desperate Romans now swallowed liquid fire. Every aspect of the execution was designed to mirror the crimes of the victim, to demonstrate that the universe has a sense of poetic justice, even if individual humans do not. The Parthians weren't done. They took Crassus's head and sent it to King Orodes II. During a royal banquet, actors were performing a Greek play called the Bacchae, a tragedy about a king destroyed by his own hubris. At the climax of the play, when the actor needed a prop head for the final scene, they used Crassus's actual severed head. The audience erupted in applause. Rome's richest man had become a theater prop. The symbolism was perfect. In Greek tragedy, characters are destroyed by the very qualities that made them great. Crassus's wealth and ambition, the traits that had elevated him to the heights of Roman power, became the instruments of his destruction. By incorporating his actual head into a performance about hubris and downfall, the Parthians transformed Crassus's death into art, into a lesson that would be remembered and retold for generations. News of Crassus's death shattered Rome. The Triumvirate was broken. Without Crassus's wealth and influence to balance their egos, Caesar and Pompey turned on each other. 5 years later, they plunged Rome into civil war, the war that ended the Roman Republic and gave birth to the Roman Empire. In death, Crassus triggered the very chaos he had tried to prevent. His invasion of Parthia had been motivated partly by a desire to achieve military glory equal to his political partners, to become a stabilizing force in Roman politics through martial achievement. Instead, his failure and death removed the financial glue holding the Triumvirate together, allowing the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey to explode into open conflict. The Republic that had survived for nearly 5 centuries fell partly because one old man couldn't accept being the third wheel. The Parthians sent another message too. They settled captured Roman soldiers in remote regions of their empire, gave them land, let them build communities. These soldiers were treated with mercy, but Crassus got gold, because the Parthians wanted the world to know that Rome's greed would burn from the inside out. The differential treatment was crucial to the message. Common soldiers who had simply followed orders, who had marched into Parthia because their commander told them to, deserved compassion. They were given the chance to build new lives, to marry local women, to raise children in peace. But the architect of the invasion, the man whose ambition had caused so much suffering, received punishment proportional to his crimes. The Parthians were saying that they understood the difference between leaders and followers, between those who start wars and those who fight them. So was it true? Did they really pour molten gold down Crassus's throat? Some modern historians doubt it. They think it might be symbolic, a story created to represent Crassus's greed rather than a literal description of his execution. The physics of molten gold are problematic. Would a human body react that way? Would the execution even be possible given the technical challenges? These are legitimate questions. But here's what we know for certain. Crassus died at Carrhae. His army was destroyed. His head was used as a theater prop, and the story of molten gold became so powerful, so memorable, that it survived 2,000 years. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the message is the same. Crassus spent his entire life chasing gold, building his fortune on the suffering of others, crushing the desperate, exploiting the weak, all so he could have more, and in the end, gold was the last thing he ever tasted. The legacy of Crassus's death extends far beyond ancient history. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked greed, about the corrupting influence of wealth, about what happens when ambition overrides wisdom. Philosophers used his story to illustrate moral lessons. Artists depicted his execution in paintings and sculptures. Writers from Plutarch to Shakespeare found in his downfall a perfect example of tragic hubris. The image of molten gold being poured into the mouth of Rome's richest man became shorthand for divine justice, for the idea that the universe eventually balances the scales, even when human courts fail to do so. In our modern world, where wealth inequality reaches levels that would have shocked even ancient Romans, where billionaires launch themselves into space while others struggle to afford food, the death of Crassus feels disturbingly relevant. His story reminds us that wealth without wisdom is dangerous, that power without compassion is corrupting, that treating human beings as means to an end rather than ends in themselves inevitably leads to destruction. They say you can't take it with you when you die. But Marcus Crassus proved you can choke on it. His death stands as one of history's most brutal lessons about the true cost of greed. Every coin he had accumulated, every property he had seized, every slave he had exploited, all of it meant nothing in the end. He died screaming in a desert, thousands of miles from Rome, his mouth filled with burning metal, his legacy forever tainted by the horror of his final moments. The gold he worshipped became his executioner. The wealth he pursued with single-minded obsession became the instrument of his agony. And the message the Parthians sent echoed through the centuries, a warning that still resonates today. Greed will consume you. Ambition without ethics will destroy you. And if you build your life on the suffering of others, don't be surprised when suffering comes for you in the end.